October 15th, 1962. Captain Richard Heiser sits in the cockpit of his U-2 spy plane, 23 miles above Cuban soil. His cameras are clicking, capturing images that will change the course of history. Below him, hidden among the palm trees and red dirt roads, are Soviet nuclear missiles capable of reaching every major American city. But while Heiser's high-altitude photographs will make the front pages, there's another group of pilots whose stories have remained largely untold. The men who flew the RF-101 Voodoo reconnaissance aircraft. The ones who went in low, fast, and dangerously close to the very weapons that could have started World War III. Before we dive deeper into these incredible, untold stories, if you're enjoying this content, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us bring you more fascinating historical narratives like this one. The morning sun is barely cresting over Homestead Air Force Base in Florida when Major Robert Ferguson receives his briefing. It's October 23rd, 1962, and the world is 8 days into what will become known as the most dangerous moment in human history. The Cuban Missile Crisis is no longer a classified secret. President Kennedy addressed the nation 2 nights ago, revealing the presence of Soviet nuclear weapons just 90 miles from American shores. Now, Ferguson and his fellow RF-101 Voodoo pilots are being asked to do something that seems almost suicidal: fly low-level reconnaissance missions over those same missile sites. Ferguson is 31 years old, a veteran of the Korean War with over 2,000 flight hours. He's flown everything from F-86 Sabres to F-100 Super Sabres, but the RF-101 Voodoo is something special. It's a modified version of the F-101 fighter, stripped of its weapons and packed with cameras. 5 cameras, to be precise. 2 in the nose, 2 in the belly, and 1 oblique camera that shoots to the side. The Voodoo can fly at nearly 900 miles per hour at treetop level, using speed and surprise as its only defense. Because unlike its fighter cousins, the RF-101 carries no weapons, no missiles, no guns, nothing. Just cameras and courage. The briefing room is thick with cigarette smoke and tension. Intelligence officers spread grainy U-2 photographs across the table, pointing to sites near San Cristobal, Sagua La Grande, and Remedios. These photos show the missile sites from 70,000 feet, good enough to confirm their existence but not detailed enough for targeting. The military needs lower altitude photographs, images that can identify every vehicle, every piece of equipment, every defensive position. That's where the Voodoo pilots come in. Major James Qualls, Ferguson's squadron commander, leans against the wall, his jaw tight. He's been flying reconnaissance missions for 12 years, but this is different. The Soviets have deployed SA-2 surface-to-air missiles throughout Cuba, the same weapons that shot down Gary Power's U-2 over the Soviet Union 2 years earlier. The SA-2 has a maximum altitude of about 60,000 feet and a minimum altitude of around 3,000 feet. The Voodoo pilots will be flying at 500 feet or lower, theoretically beneath the SA-2's engagement envelope. Theoretically. But there are also conventional anti-aircraft guns, and those can reach them just fine. Ferguson studies the maps, memorizing every turn, every landmark. The mission profile is simple on paper: cross the Cuban coast at high speed and low altitude, photograph the assigned targets, and get out. Simple, except for the fact that he'll be flying alone, unarmed, over hostile territory bristling with Soviet and Cuban forces on high alert. The entire mission will last maybe 20 minutes over Cuba, but those 20 minutes could decide whether he lives or dies. Outside, the Florida heat is already building, making the tarmac shimmer. Ferguson walks toward his aircraft, his flight suit soaked with sweat that has nothing to do with the temperature. The RF-101C Voodoo gleams in the morning light, its long nose giving it an aggressive, predatory look. The ground crew has been working all night, ensuring every system is perfect. One of the crew chiefs, a young sergeant from Alabama named Williams, gives Ferguson a thumbs up. Williams has been working on this particular Voodoo for 6 months. He knows every rivet, every hydraulic line. If anyone can keep this bird flying, it's him. Ferguson climbs into the cockpit, the familiar smell of jet fuel and electronics surrounding him. He straps in, going through his pre-flight checklist with practiced efficiency: radio check, camera systems check, navigation systems check. Everything is green. The twin J-57 engines wind up with a rising howl, and Ferguson feels their power vibrating through the airframe. This is it. In a few minutes, he'll be heading south, toward an island that might already be preparing to launch nuclear weapons. The tower clears him for takeoff, and Ferguson advances the throttles. The Voodoo accelerates down the runway, the acceleration pressing him back into his seat. At 160 knots, he pulls back on the stick, and the aircraft leaps into the air. Florida falls away beneath him, the coastline a thin line between land and sea. Ferguson sets his course south, the morning sun warming the right side of his canopy. The flight to Cuba takes less than 30 minutes at the Voodoo's cruising speed. Ferguson drops down to 200 feet over the water, the deep blue of the Florida Straits rushing past beneath him. At this altitude, he's below most radar coverage, making it harder for the Soviets to track him. The ocean spray leaves salt crystals on his canopy. His heart is pounding, his hands tight on the stick and throttles. Every pilot feels fear before combat, and make no mistake, this is combat. The fact that he's not shooting back doesn't make it any less dangerous. The Cuban coast appears on the horizon, a dark green line against the lighter blue of the sea. Ferguson checks his navigation one more time, confirming his position. He's coming in near Mariel, west of Havana. Then he'll turn southeast toward the missile sites near San Cristobal. The cameras are already running, capturing everything from the moment he crosses the beach. The Voodoo's cameras shoot on a time interval, clicking off frames every few seconds, creating a continuous photographic record of everything beneath and beside the aircraft. Ferguson crosses the coastline at 450 knots, barely 300 feet above the ground. The landscape transforms from blue water to red earth and green vegetation in an instant. Small farms flash past, chickens scattering as his sonic boom rolls over them. He can see people in the fields, looking up in shock as the silver jet screams overhead. This is the reality of low-level reconnaissance. You're not an invisible observer. Everyone knows you're there. The terrain rises slightly as he heads inland, low hills covered in thick tropical vegetation. Ferguson adjusts his altitude, staying just high enough to clear obstacles, but low enough to remain below the SA-2 envelope. His navigation is by visual reference and timing. He has a map strapped to his knee, showing the key landmarks, but at this speed, everything happens fast. He spots a road intersection that matches his map, makes a slight course correction, and continues southeast. Then he sees it, the first missile site. It's exactly where the U-2 photographs said it would be, but seeing it from 300 feet is completely different from seeing it from 70,000 feet. The site is a cleared area carved out of the forest, with canvas-covered vehicles arranged in a star pattern around the center. Ferguson can see soldiers running, pointing up at him. He can see the missiles themselves, long cylindrical shapes on their transport trailers, still being assembled. The cameras are clicking furiously, capturing every detail. Anti-aircraft fire erupts from positions around the site. Ferguson sees the muzzle flashes, then tracers arcing up toward him, bright orange streaks against the green landscape. The Voodoo's speed is his salvation. By the time the gunners react and fire, he's already past their aiming point. The tracers fall behind him, searching for a target that's no longer there. But his hands are shaking now. This is real. They're shooting at him with live ammunition, trying to kill him. He banks hard left, following his planned route to the next target. The G-forces press him into his seat as the Voodoo turns, the wings biting into the humid Cuban air. Below him, a military convoy is moving along a dirt road, trucks carrying what look like missile components. The cameras capture it all. More anti-aircraft fire, more tracers reaching up like deadly fingers. One burst comes close enough that Ferguson sees the rounds pass just above his canopy, so close he can almost feel them. His mouth is dry. He tries to swallow but can't. The fear is there, cold and real in his gut, but his training keeps him focused. Fly the mission, get the photographs, get home. Everything else is secondary. He spots the second missile site, this one more complete than the first. The missiles are erected now, pointing skyward on their launchers. Ferguson's mind does the calculation automatically. Those missiles can reach Washington, New York, most of the eastern United States. And here he is, flying past them at 300 feet, armed with nothing but cameras. More gunfire. The sky around him fills with black puffs of exploding shells. The Cubans and Soviets are throwing everything they have at him. Ferguson jinks the aircraft left and right, making himself a harder target, though at this speed and altitude, evasive maneuvers are limited. Hit a hill and you're dead. Pull too hard and you'll black out or overstress the airframe. All he can do is fly fast, fly low, and pray that the gunners can't track him quickly enough. The mission timeline shows he's been over Cuba for 12 minutes. It feels like hours. His fuel gauge is dropping steadily. The Voodoo burns fuel at an incredible rate at low altitude and high speed. He has enough to complete the mission and get home, but there's no margin for error, no time for second passes or extended loitering. One pass, get the photos, get out. The third and final target site appears ahead, this one near Sagua La Grande. Ferguson can see more activity here, more vehicles, more personnel. The Soviets are working around the clock to get these missiles operational. Intelligence estimates they'll be ready to launch within days, maybe hours. The cameras click and whir, recording everything. Then suddenly, something different. A new type of vehicle, something the analysts haven't seen before. Ferguson makes a mental note, knowing the debriefers will want every detail. The anti-aircraft fire is intense now. The defenders have had time to prepare, to track his route. They know he has to photograph the sites, so they're concentrating their fire along the most likely approach paths. Ferguson sees tracers converging ahead of him, a wall of fire he has to fly through. He pushes the throttles to military power, the engine screaming, and dives even lower. 50 feet now, maybe less. The Voodoo is shaking from the turbulence, the shock waves bouncing off the ground. But he's through the fire, and the third sight is sliding past beneath him, recorded forever on film. Now comes the hardest part, getting out. Ferguson turns northwest, heading for the coast and open water, but the Cubans and Soviets know this too. They know he has to exit somewhere, and they're ready. He spots a concentration of anti-aircraft positions ahead, dug in along the likely exit routes. There's no choice but to fly through them. He checks his fuel one more time. Still enough, but barely. The guns open up as he approaches, a concentration of fire that lights up the ground like a fireworks display. Ferguson flies into it, every instinct screaming at him to turn away, to find another route. But there is no other route. The cameras are still running, capturing even these defensive positions. Information for the intelligence analysts, if he makes it home. Tracers pass on both sides of the canopy. Something hits the aircraft, a solid thunk that he feels through the airframe. Warning lights flash on his panel, hydraulic pressure dropping, but the controls still respond. The Voodoo is still flying. He crosses the coast at 450 knots, the beautiful blue water of the Caribbean spread out before him. Behind him, Cuba recedes, the gunfire falling silent as he moves out of range. Ferguson lets out a breath he didn't know he was holding. His hands are trembling on the controls. The adrenaline that kept him sharp during the mission is draining away, leaving him exhausted. But he's not safe yet. He still has to get back to Homestead, and the Voodoo has taken damage. The hydraulic pressure continues to drop. Ferguson runs through his emergency procedures, trying to isolate the leak, but it's no use. He's losing fluid. The flight controls feel mushy, less responsive. He calculates the distance to Homestead, 90 miles, maybe 20 minutes at current speed. The question is whether the hydraulics will last that long. If they fail completely, he'll have to eject, and the aircraft, with all its precious photographs, will end up at the bottom of the ocean. He throttles back slightly, trying to reduce the strain on the hydraulic system. The Voodoo settles into a gentle cruise, the engines humming smoothly despite everything they've been through. The Florida coast appears on the horizon, a sight more beautiful than anything Ferguson has ever seen. The tower at Homestead is already clearing emergency equipment to standby just in case. Ferguson gives them his status, keeping his voice calm and professional despite the fear crawling up his spine. The approach to Homestead is perfect. Ferguson lines up on the runway, lowering his landing gear and flaps despite the failing hydraulics. The controls are barely responding now, but he has enough authority to keep the aircraft stable. The runway threshold passes beneath him and he flares gently, settling the Voodoo onto the concrete with barely a bump. As soon as the wheels touch, he deploys the drag chute and brings the aircraft to a stop. Fire trucks and ambulances are racing alongside, but they're not needed. Ferguson is home, alive, and the mission film is intact. The ground crew swarms the aircraft as Ferguson shuts down the engines. His legs are shaking as he climbs out of the cockpit, nearly stumbling on the ladder. Major Qualls is there, a rare smile on his weathered face. They don't speak. They just shake hands, the understanding between them complete. Ferguson has just flown one of the most dangerous reconnaissance missions of the Cold War and survived. Within hours, the film from Ferguson's cameras is being developed and analyzed. The photographs are everything the military needed. Clear, detailed images of the missile sites, showing exactly what equipment is present, how far along the construction is, where the defensive positions are located. This information will be crucial in the days ahead as President Kennedy and his advisors decide how to respond to the Soviet provocation. But Ferguson's mission is just the first of many. Over the next 13 days, RF-101 Voodoo pilots will fly hundreds of low-level reconnaissance missions over Cuba, each one as dangerous as the last. Some pilots will fly multiple missions per day, going back to the same sites again and again to track the Soviets' progress. The toll on these men is enormous. The constant stress, the repeated exposure to enemy fire, the knowledge that each mission could be their last. Captain Gerald Coffey, another Voodoo pilot, flies his first mission 3 days after Ferguson's. Coffey is 27 years old, newly married. With a young son he's only seen in photographs. His mission takes him over the missile sites near Remedios in central Cuba. The experience is everything he feared and worse. The anti-aircraft fire is so intense that the sky seems solid with explosions. His Voodoo takes multiple hits, punching holes in the wings and fuselage, but somehow stays airborne. Coffey makes it home, but the aircraft is so badly damaged it's written off, stripped for parts. The Voodoo pilots develop their own techniques for survival. They vary their routes and altitudes, never flying the same pattern twice. They time their missions for early morning or late afternoon when the sun is low and makes visual tracking harder for the gunners. They study every mission film, looking for new defensive positions, new threats. Knowledge is survival. The more they know about what's waiting for them, the better their chances of coming home. Lieutenant David Bradburn draws the night missions, flying in total darkness over a hostile island. Night reconnaissance is even more dangerous than daylight missions. Navigation is harder, Terrain avoidance is harder, and if something goes wrong, ejecting over Cuba at night means almost certain capture. But the photographs are needed, so Bradburn straps in and goes night after night. He uses flares dropped from other aircraft to illuminate the target sites, the magnesium fires turning night into day for a few brief seconds, while his cameras click and record. The psychological pressure on these pilots is immense. Unlike bomber crews or fighter pilots, who at least have weapons to shoot back with, the reconnaissance pilots are completely defenseless. Their only protection is speed, surprise, and the skill of their flying. Every mission means flying into enemy fire, knowing you can't fight back, can only run. Some pilots handle it better than others. Some develop superstitions, wearing the same lucky charm, eating the same breakfast before each mission. Others become fatalistic, convinced their number is up, but flying anyway. Major Rudolph Anderson flies both U-2 and RF-101 missions during the crisis. Anderson is 35, a quiet, deeply religious man from South Carolina. He volunteers for the most dangerous missions, the ones over the heavily defended western sites near Havana. On October 27th, the 13th day of the crisis, Anderson is flying a U-2 mission over Cuba when his aircraft is hit by an SA-2 missile. The U-2 disintegrates, and Anderson is killed instantly, becoming the only American combat casualty of the Cuban Missile Crisis. His death sends shockwaves through the current reconnaissance community. If they can get Anderson, they can get anyone. But the missions continue. The RF-101 pilots keep flying, even knowing what happened to Anderson. Because the alternative is worse. If they don't fly, if they don't get the photographs, the military and political leaders are making decisions blind. The photographs from the Voodoo missions provide the hard evidence needed to track Soviet compliance with agreements, to verify that missiles are being dismantled and removed. This isn't abstract reconnaissance. This is information that directly affects whether nuclear war happens or not. Captain Jack Fry flies his last Voodoo mission on November 2nd, 5 days after Anderson's death. Fry has flown 12 missions over Cuba in 3 weeks, more than almost any other pilot. His nerves are shot. He's not sleeping, barely eating, but he straps in one more time because that's what's needed. This mission is a verification run, photographing missile sites that the Soviets claim to have dismantled. Fry finds the sites empty, the missiles gone, leaving only scarred earth where they once stood. It's the beginning of the end, the first sign that the crisis is truly resolving. The photographs from the Voodoo missions become part of the historical record of the crisis. They're shown to the United Nations, used to prove the Soviet missile deployment to the world. They're analyzed in the White House, helping President Kennedy make moment-by-moment decisions about how to respond. They're studied by military planners, preparing for every possible contingency. And they're classified, locked away in vaults, because they reveal too much about American reconnaissance capabilities. For decades, the Voodoo pilots can't talk about what they saw, what they experienced. The missions remain classified, the details known only to those with the highest security clearances. The pilots return to normal duty, flying other aircraft, training new pilots, living with memories they can't share. Some struggle with what we now call post-traumatic stress, though in the 1960s, there's no recognition of such things. You're expected to be tough, to handle it, to move on. So they do, carrying their stories in silence. Ferguson retires from the Air Force in 1975 as a lieutenant colonel. He settles in Arizona, works in aerospace consulting, raises a family. He never talks about Cuba, not even to his wife, until the missions are finally declassified in the 1990s. Only then does he begin to share what happened during those October days in 1962. The fear he felt, the tracers coming up at him, the damage to his aircraft, the knowledge that one mistake would mean death or capture. Coffee is shot down over North Vietnam in 1966 and spends 7 years as a prisoner of war. The Hanoi Hilton is its own special hell, but Coffee says nothing compares to the pure terror of those low-level runs over Cuba. In Vietnam, he was flying a fighter, armed and dangerous. Over Cuba, he was naked, defenseless, relying only on his skill and luck. That kind of vulnerability, that kind of exposure, leaves scars that never fully heal. The other pilots scatter to different assignments, different lives. Some stay in the military, rising through the ranks. Others leave, seeking calmer careers in civilian aviation or other fields. But they all carry Cuba with them. Those days when they flew into the teeth of Soviet air defenses, unarmed and alone, to gather the information that helped prevent World War III. They're bound together by an experience that few others can understand. Members of an exclusive club nobody wanted to join. The RF-101 Voodoo itself fades into history. The last operational Voodoos are retired from active service in the early 1970s, replaced by more modern reconnaissance aircraft with better cameras and electronic systems. A few are preserved in museums, their sleek lines and predatory noses standing silent testimony to the men who flew them. But most are scrapped, cut up for salvage, their aluminum recycled into other uses, The aircraft that flew through fire over Cuba become soda cans and car parts. But the legacy of what those pilots did lives on. The Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved peacefully, in part because of the accurate intelligence provided by reconnaissance missions. The photographs from the Voodoo flights gave American leaders the confidence to negotiate from a position of knowledge rather than fear. They could see exactly what the Soviets were doing, could track compliance with agreements, could verify that missiles were being removed rather than just hidden. That transparency, purchased with the courage of pilots like Ferguson and Coffey, helped both sides step back from the brink. The lessons from the crisis reshape Cold War strategy. The importance of accurate intelligence is driven home at the highest levels. Reconnaissance programs receive increased funding and priority. New systems are developed, better cameras, better aircraft, better satellites. The reconnaissance community grows in importance, though always operating in the shadows, their successes classified, their failures public. For the Voodoo pilots themselves, the recognition comes slowly, if at all. There are no parades, no medal ceremonies, no public celebrations of what they did. Their missions remain classified for decades. When the 50th anniversary of the crisis arrives in 2012, some of the surviving pilots are finally interviewed, their stories recorded for history. They're old men now, in their 70s and 80s, but the memories are still vivid. They remember the fear, the adrenaline, the tracers, the relief of making it home. Ferguson, attending a reunion of reconnaissance pilots, finally meets some of the intelligence analysts who studied his photographs all those years ago. They thank him, tell him how crucial his missions were, how the photographs he risked his life to take were shown to the president himself. Ferguson listens, nods, accepts their gratitude. But what he really wants to talk about is the other pilots, the ones who didn't make it home from other missions in other places. Anderson, shot down over Cuba. The pilots lost in Vietnam. The ones who crashed during training. The reconnaissance community paid a high price for the intelligence they gathered. What the RF-101 Voodoo pilots saw during the Cuban Missile Crisis was the machinery of nuclear war being assembled 90 miles from American soil. They saw Soviet technicians working around the clock to make the missiles operational. They saw Cuban troops digging defensive positions, preparing for an American invasion that seemed inevitable. They saw a small island bristling with weapons, a powder keg waiting for a spark. And they photographed it all, bringing back the evidence that helped rational minds prevail over fear and anger. What they never told, what they couldn't tell for decades, was the human cost of gathering that intelligence, the fear they felt every time they strapped into the cockpit, the nightmares that came after, the sudden startle at loud noises, the way their hands would shake when they let themselves remember. The friends who didn't come home, the empty places at the briefing table, the personal effects packed up and shipped to grieving families. The weight of knowing that the photographs they took might be the last thing they ever did. But they also never told the pride they felt, the knowledge that they were part of something larger than themselves. They helped prevent nuclear war. They gave their leaders the information needed to make good decisions. They showed courage in the face of overwhelming danger, flying mission after mission even when every instinct screamed at them to refuse. That kind of courage doesn't come from fearlessness. It comes from being terrified and doing the job anyway. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended on October 28, 1962, when Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for American promises not to invade the island and to remove American missiles from Turkey. The world stepped back from the nuclear brink. But for weeks and months afterward, RF-101 Voodoo pilots continued flying verification missions, ensuring the Soviets kept their word. They photographed missiles being crated up, loaded onto ships, carried away from Cuban ports. They documented the dismantling of the infrastructure that had supported the missile deployment. These verification missions were less dangerous than the initial reconnaissance flights, but they still required courage. The pilots still flew low and fast over Cuban territory, still faced anti-aircraft fire, still dealt with the possibility of mechanical failure or pilot error ending their lives in a Cuban jungle. But they flew because the mission required it, because verification was just as important as initial discovery. Trust but verify became the watchword of the Cold War, and the Voodoo pilots provided the verification. The stories these pilots carried, the experiences they could never fully share, shaped the rest of their lives. Some became advocates for arms control, believing that no one should ever again have to face the prospect of nuclear war. Others became fierce Cold Warriors, convinced that only American strength and vigilance prevented Soviet aggression. But all of them understood, in a way few others could, how close the world came to destruction in October 1962. Captain Gerald Coffey, speaking decades after the crisis, described the peculiar loneliness of the reconnaissance pilot. You're part of a team, supported by ground crews and intelligence analysts and mission planners. But when you're over the target, you're absolutely alone. Nobody can help you. Nobody can fight for you. It's just you, your aircraft, and the people trying to kill you. That loneliness, Coffey said, never quite leaves you. Even surrounded by family and friends, part of you is still there, alone in the cockpit, watching the tracers reach up toward you. The photographic intelligence gathered by the Voodoo pilots during the Cuban Missile Crisis filled thousands of pages of analysis. Every image was studied in detail, measured, compared with earlier photographs, examined for changes. Analysts counted vehicles, identified equipment, tracked construction progress. They built detailed models of the missile sites, understanding exactly how the Soviet forces were organizing themselves. This information fed into war plans, diplomatic strategies, and presidential briefings. Lieutenant William Estes flew 7 missions during the peak of the crisis, between October 23rd and October 28th. Each mission blurred together in his memory afterward, a continuous stream of low-level flying, anti-aircraft fire, and the desperate hope of making it back to base. Estes was 26 years old, engaged to be married to his high school sweetheart back in Kansas. He carried her photograph in his flight suit pocket on every mission, a talisman against the fear that threatened to overwhelm him. On his 4th mission, Estes's Voodoo took a direct hit from an anti-aircraft shell. The round punched through the left wing, miraculously missing fuel lines and control cables, but leaving a hole the size of a basketball. The aircraft shook violently, wanting to roll left, and Estes fought the controls all the way back to Florida. He landed with the wing trailing fuel vapor, the ground crew amazed he made it home at all. The next morning, Estes was back in the cockpit, flying a different aircraft over the same sites. There was no time for fear, no time to process what had happened. The mission came first. The intelligence analysts who studied the Voodoo photographs worked in windowless rooms at the National Photographic Interpretation Center in Washington. They used stereoscopic viewers to examine the images in 3 dimensions, measuring shadows to determine the height of objects, counting tire tracks to estimate the number of vehicles at a site. They became intimately familiar with Soviet equipment, able to identify specific missile types from the smallest details, and they understood, perhaps better than anyone except the pilots themselves, the risks being taken to gather this intelligence. Sarah Mitchell was one of those analysts, a 24-year-old graduate of MIT who had joined the intelligence community straight out of college. She spent 16 hours a day during the crisis poring over reconnaissance photographs, tracking every change at the missile sites. When she saw the damage to Estes' aircraft in the mission film, the hole in the wing clearly visible in several frames, she felt sick to her stomach. Someone had almost died to get her these photographs. That knowledge never left her. The coordination between the pilots and the analysts became crucial as the crisis progressed. The analysts would identify gaps in the intelligence, areas that needed closer examination, and the mission planners would task specific flights to fill those gaps. Sometimes this meant multiple runs over the same site on the same day, approaching from different angles to get different perspectives. For the pilots, this meant increased danger. The Cuban and Soviet gunners learned quickly, predicting likely approach routes and concentrating their fire accordingly. Captain Thomas Reed drew one of these repeat missions on October 26th, the day before Anderson was shot down. Reed had already flown over the Sagua La Grande site twice in the previous 3 days. Now he was being sent back a 3rd time, because the analysts needed better images of what appeared to be a new type of support vehicle. Reed knew this was dangerous. The gunners would be expecting another reconnaissance flight. They would be ready. He was right. As Reed approached the site at dawn, the anti-aircraft fire started before he even reached the target. The defenders had learned to fire ahead of his flight path, creating a box of fire he would have to fly through. Reed had no choice but to press on. The cameras needed those images. He pushed the Voodoo down to 200 feet, so low that he could see individual soldiers scrambling for their positions. The aircraft shook from the concussion of exploding shells. Something hit the fuselage with a metallic bang, but the controls still responded. Reed held his course, the cameras clicking, then pulled up and dove away to the north, heading for the coast. Only when he was feet wet, over open ocean, did Reed allow himself to breathe. His flight suit was soaked with sweat, his hands aching from gripping the controls so tightly. He checked his instruments and found multiple warning lights glowing, hydraulic pressure low, fuel pressure fluctuating, oil temperature rising. The Voodoo had taken more damage than he thought. Reed made the decision to head for the nearest American base, which happened to be Key West rather than Homestead. He radioed ahead, declaring an emergency, and the tower cleared everything else out of the pattern. The landing at Key West was rough. The Voodoo's damaged hydraulics made the controls sluggish, and Reed had to use brute force to keep the aircraft aligned with the runway. The touchdown was hard enough to blow out both main tires, and the aircraft skidded sideways before Reed regained control and brought it to a stop. The fire crews surrounded the smoking aircraft immediately. Reed climbed out on shaking legs to find that his Voodoo had taken 7 hits. 7 pieces of Soviet and Cuban anti-aircraft fire had struck his aircraft, any one of which could have killed him if it had hit a few inches differently. The mission film was rushed to Washington on the next courier flight. The analysts got their images of the support vehicle, identifying it as a Soviet-made generator truck used to power the missile guidance systems. This information helped confirm the timeline for when the missiles might become operational. Reed got a day off to recover, then was back in the cockpit, flying another mission, because that was the job. That was what had to be done. But behind every photograph was a pilot who risked everything to take it. Behind every crisp image of a missile on its launcher was a man flying through anti-aircraft fire at 300 feet, his hands tight on the controls, his mouth dry with fear. The photographs are historical artifacts now, displayed in museums and textbooks. But they're also memorials to the men who took them, silent testimonies to courage under fire. They represent decisions made in fractions of a second, courses held despite every instinct screaming to turn away, missions completed when survival itself seemed impossible. Major James Qualls, the squadron commander, flew his own missions while also managing the overall reconnaissance effort. Qualls understood the strain his pilots were under because he felt it himself. Every morning he faced the same choice they did: strap into an unarmed aircraft and fly into enemy fire, or refuse and live with the knowledge that he had failed when his country needed him most. For Qualls and his pilots, there was really no choice at all. They were reconnaissance pilots. This was their purpose, their calling. The fear was real, the danger was real, but so was the duty. The nights were the hardest. During the day, there was always something to do: briefings to attend, missions to fly, aircraft to maintain. But at night, lying in their quarters at Homestead, the pilots were alone with their thoughts. They thought about the missions they had flown, the fire they had faced, the damage their aircraft had taken. They thought about Anderson, killed over Cuba, and wondered if tomorrow would be their turn. Sleep came hard, filled with dreams of tracers and explosions, of aircraft spinning out of control, of ejecting over hostile territory. Some pilots wrote letters home that they left with their squadron mates to be mailed only if they didn't return. These letters spoke of love and pride, of hopes and regrets, of the importance of the mission they were flying. Few of these letters were ever sent, but writing them helped the pilots make peace with the possibility of death. It was a way of controlling the uncontrollable, of leaving something behind if the worst happened. The RF-101 Voodoo pilots saw the Cuban Missile Crisis not as a political chess game or a theoretical exercise in nuclear deterrence, but as a very real, very immediate threat. They saw the missiles up close enough to read the Cyrillic markings on the transport vehicles. They saw Soviet soldiers looking up at them, saw the gunners tracking their aircraft, saw the muzzle flashes as anti-aircraft weapons opened fire. They experienced the crisis in a way that policymakers in Washington could only imagine. And what they never told, what perhaps they could never fully articulate, was how it felt to carry that burden. To know that their photographs might be the evidence that started a war or the proof that prevented one. To understand that millions of lives might depend on whether they successfully completed their mission. That kind of responsibility placed on the shoulders of young men in their 20s and 30s is almost incomprehensible. Yet they carried it, flew their missions, and brought home the photographs that made history. The psychological impact of the crisis on the pilots manifested in different ways for different men. Some became hypervigilant, constantly scanning the skies even years after the crisis ended, unable to shake the habit of watching for threats. Others developed what military psychologists would later recognize as survivor's guilt, haunted by the question of why they made it home when others, like Anderson, did not. Still others channeled their experiences into determination, becoming instructors who trained the next generation of reconnaissance pilots with an intensity born of hard experience. Captain David Chen flew his last Voodoo mission on November 8th, after the crisis had officially ended, but while verification flights continued. Chen had completed 11 missions over Cuba, more than most, and the strain showed in his face. He had lost 15 pounds during the crisis, unable to eat properly between missions. His hands developed a slight tremor that never completely went away. But he completed his final mission with the same precision and courage he had shown on his first, photographing the last remnants of Soviet equipment being loaded onto ships in Cuban harbors. When Chen returned to Homestead, after that final mission, he parked his Voodoo and sat in the cockpit for long minutes, unable to move. The ground crew chief, Sergeant Williams, climbed up to check on him and found Chen crying silently, the emotional dam finally breaking after weeks of controlled terror. Williams, who had maintained Chen's aircraft through all 11 missions, simply put a hand on his shoulder and waited until the pilot was ready to climb down. No words were necessary. Both men understood what those missions had cost. The families of the Voodoo pilots endured their own private agonies during the crisis. Most knew their husbands or fathers were flying dangerous missions, but the details were classified. They waited in base housing or in homes scattered across the country, watching the news, knowing that any moment could bring the knock on the door that would shatter their worlds. When their pilots came home safe, the relief was overwhelming. But the knowledge that it could happen again on the next mission or the one after that never quite left them. Mary Ferguson, Robert Ferguson's wife, later described the Cuban Missile Crisis as the longest 13 days of her life. She watched her husband leave before dawn each morning, not knowing if he would return. She kept their 2 young children occupied with activities, trying to maintain normalcy while the world teetered on the edge of nuclear war. When Ferguson came home each evening alive and safe, she wanted to hold him and never let go. But Ferguson couldn't talk about the missions, couldn't share what he had experienced, and that silence created a distance between them that took years to heal. The ground crews who maintained the Voodoo aircraft deserve their own recognition in this story. These men worked around the clock during the crisis, ensuring that every aircraft was ready to fly, that every camera system was functioning perfectly, that every mechanical issue was resolved immediately. Sergeant Williams and his team often worked 20-hour days, fueling and arming aircraft, changing engines, patching battle damage. They knew their pilots were flying into danger, and they took personal responsibility for keeping them safe through perfect maintenance. When a Voodoo returned with battle damage, the ground crews worked frantically to repair it and get it back into service. They patched holes, replaced damaged components, tested and retested systems. Sometimes an aircraft would land severely damaged in the morning and be flying again by afternoon, the crew having worked miracles to make it airworthy. The pilots trusted these men absolutely, knowing that their lives depended on the quality of the maintenance. That trust was never betrayed. Today, reconnaissance is done primarily by satellites and unmanned drones, remote sensors that never put human lives at risk. The days of pilots flying alone into hostile airspace, armed only with cameras, seem almost quaintly old-fashioned. But the legacy of those Voodoo pilots lives on in every reconnaissance mission, every intelligence operation that helps prevent conflict. They proved that accurate information gathered at great personal risk can change the course of history. The men who flew the RF-101 Voodoo over Cuba in October 1962 were ordinary men asked to do extraordinary things. They were sons and husbands, fathers and brothers. They liked baseball and beer, told bad jokes, complained about the food. But when their country needed them, when the stakes were literally the survival of civilization, they climbed into their cockpits and flew into danger without weapons, without protection, relying only on their skill and courage. What they saw, they never forgot. What they did, they rarely spoke about. But what they accomplished helped save the world. And that legacy, carried by the few surviving pilots and honored by those who came after them, is the real story of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Not just the political maneuvering in Washington and Moscow, but the courage of individuals willing to risk everything for something larger than themselves. The tracers they dodged, the missiles they photographed, the fear they conquered, all of it is part of American history now. But for the men who flew those missions, it will always be personal, immediate, visceral. They were there. They saw it. They lived it. And they carried those memories, those images, those feelings for the rest of their lives. Silent professionals doing the job nobody else could do at a moment when the world needed them most. That is what the RF-101 Voodoo pilots saw and never told. Until now.